My name is Olivia Knauss, and I am CAA's RAAMP Project Assistant. I also have Cali Buckley on the call with me as well. She is CAA's Grants and Special Programs Manager. And we are very excited to dive into our coffee gathering about designing a collections plan. So to give a little bit of context to perhaps some of the participants out there that are attending a coffee gathering for the first time, just a couple of reminders. You're able to turn off your microphone and your video throughout the duration of the call. If you have a question throughout, feel free to turn on your video if you'd like to ask out loud, or feel free to type in your question on the left side of the panel in the comments section. Usually at this point in the call, Cali would introduce a presenter or a featured speaker, but this month is a little bit different because we don't have a specific presenter. We're hoping to have more of a scholarly conversation about the process of creating a collections plan for academic art museums, because it seems as though it's an elusive topic. This month's topic for this coffee gathering came from an inquiry from Casey Messick-Braun's email on the AMG listserv, because she is spearheading the creation of a collection plan at the Spencer Museum of Art. And in the process of her research, she has found that there's not many examples out there. So we're hoping to use this coffee gathering as a way of sharing expertise and answering questions on the process. And from the thread, just to kind of start us all on the same page, from what I've gathered is a collection plan is a written document that's drafted collaboratively that outlines an academic art museum's collecting priorities. So this official and internal document assists our academic art museum professionals and their colleges and universities in making decisions about future acquisitions and the future of their collections. So Casey and others in this listserv raised questions about what the plan looks like, who's involved in the creative process, I guess you would say, who should have access to the finished document, and how it should be used kind of day to day, and then how often museums should revisit these plans. So we hope that these questions are something that we can explore in this coffee gathering, and perhaps just use those starting off questions as kind of an entry into the conversation. And obviously, if anyone else has questions that they'd like answered throughout the coffee gathering, please feel free to pitch in. Do you have anything to add, Cali, before we get started?
Well, I also wanted to mention, hi everyone, that there are some documents that folks have used when creating their own collection plan. There are some examples out there. Some of them are with AAM, and you need to have a password to get to those. But we're also hoping to put together some examples that are more freely available to actually share on the RAAMP website as part of our resources for academic art museum professionals. So if anyone would like to give us any examples or any documents that they would find useful, we'd really like to create a repository for those. So in addition to this recording and this conversation, we'd like to have some resources that people can use in the future. So I'd love to hear if anyone's willing to help us with that.
Wonderful. So I guess that we'll start off with the first question, kind of about what a plan looks like, and hoping to tap into some of the experiences of all of you participants out there. If you have created a collection plan for your academic art museum, what sections did you include in the plan? And again, feel free to turn on your video or type on the left side in the chat box.
I mean, what were some of the sections that were included in the examples we looked at from AAM?
Sure. So I have a sample document from AAM with sections kind of with a preamble and a statement of purpose from the Smith College Museum of Art. And there's kind of a statement of the mission as well as the collecting vision, kind of outlining the motivations of the museum, and then specific subsections of the collecting areas of that particular museum. So like ancient art, European, et cetera, and then each section ends with a motivation or kind of a drive to where that collection will go in the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm. And it seemed like there were some questions floating around in terms of who's responsible for some of this, because it seems like at a lot of different institutions, there could be a number of different people involved, mm-hmm. whether it be the museum director, curators, and other folks in the administration. So I think it's kind of interesting that each one of these has to be so different, really depending on the structure of the institution, as well as their existing collection. And I think a lot of it is, just like an editor coming to a publisher has to work with what the previous editor had published, you kind of have to work with what you have, and you have to work with a certain number of people that have to help you with that. So we'd really like to hear some examples from folks that had been bringing this up, especially on the AAMG listserv. There were a lot of folks that kind of wanted to talk about their own instance and see what other folks had to say about it. So we're really looking for a few participants to really sort of bring this out so that we have some examples to work with, if anybody's willing.
I think we have some typers in the left-hand side, so we'll give them a second.
Sure.
I can kind of weigh in too for now while we're getting some written questions, since I was the one who brought this up. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. So, I mean, I think one of the things that came up with us when looking at what sections to include, we were really basing ourselves off of the AAM's Guide to Collection Planning, which is a relatively small kind of volume that outlines a lot of key components of collection plans, and includes a lot of, Olivia, what you had said. Some other sections were sort of a history of the collection and a history of the institution. But some of the questions or concerns that our group had about this was the plans got really, really long, and we're struggling with how to make this a really usable document, something that isn't just going to sit on a shelf and gather dust because it has all of this information in it. So we're kind of struggling with what felt like it was really the most important thing to include, while still being something that's useful that people can turn to and actually consult in moments when trying to make decisions about new acquisitions or deaccessions.
Great, thank you. And that's something that I would like to share along with this recording, is that document, as well as hopefully an outline of what kinds of other questions people have in terms of what sections could be added, who at their institution was responsible for that. I think it might actually be useful to even have a survey about this. Does anyone else think that that would be useful for them?
I think so. I think that would be really helpful, and that's definitely something we could share through RAAMP as well. There is a comment on the left side saying, asking for clarification that for if facilitators will be posing and answering questions based on available resources, or the discussion will rely on call and response from those in attendance. So I guess for those that perhaps have just joined, we would like to use this coffee gathering as a way of discussing how folks participating in this coffee gathering have approached the creation of a collection plan for their specific institutions. And we do have a list of questions that I shared through the invite that we'd like to discuss if that is of interest to you. But also, this is really an open format for anyone to kind of have conversations with folks that are already kind of in this space and to talk about how they've approached this at their different institutions. So I hope that is a little bit more helpful in clarifying our goal for today. So I guess I'll throw out another question to see how people have talked about this at their institutions. Who is involved in the creation of a collection plan? As Callie was mentioning before, it seems like a lot of different institutions involve different staff members, administrators, collections committees. So we're really kind of interested to hear who is involved and if there is kind of any commonalities between different institutions, or if anyone has had any specific success with different groups of people in making the collection plan.
Sure, and if you type in sort of the example of your own institution, we can just sort of present these to you and see how they're a little bit different. So, so thank you, Jen. We have one from her saying, we're at a small academic museum with a director, a curator, and she's the curator, and a part-time registrar. And she, as a curator, ended up writing the collections plan. And, I mean, I don't find that necessarily surprising, but I do think at other places it's usually the director kind of takes control of that. And Ksenia just said that in looking at her existing collection plan, there are a few more helpful sections, including weaknesses, in addition to identifying strengths, which, yeah, I can definitely see, you know, holes in collections is certainly something that appears after a while. Connections to other institutions, which is also very interesting. And shaping the desired collection, as well as deaccessioning. And yeah, deaccessioning is, of course, a big topic. But yeah, I think that's really useful to kind of get a feel for where the academic museum lies, because it is so different in each university. I originally came from the Palmer Museum of Art at Penn State University, which had very close ties with the art history department as well as the art ed department. And a lot of their collection was really used very closely for teaching, whereas other academic museums don't have that kind of connection. But we also had some very interesting different parts. There's a whole collection of chairs that is essentially never on view, that was gifted to them, and a lot of it was from, a lot of the other works were from Barbara Palmer, so we kind of had to work with those things that we had. And we had a huge strength in prints, especially because we had this great American print collection, and it's very, very useful for teaching to sort of bring out and that sort of thing. But yeah, it was interesting to see what the different curators and the old director had to say about what else we could use in sort of in conversation with the art history department. Well, and there could also be a section on how the plan might intersect with other institutional plans, such as a strategic or interpretive plan. Yeah, absolutely, and that kind of further embeds the role of the museum so that everyone is aware of it. Olivia, do you want to read Hope's?
Oh, sure. So we have another comment from Hope. She says she is a curator at a small museum and is also drafting a collection plan, so this comes at a good moment. They're having difficulty identifying who from the community should be involved. AAM recommends the community involvement, and we really don't know what that can look like. I think community is definitely a tricky word because it can be defined in a lot of different ways. If you're thinking about your campus community, your greater town community, and so on and so forth. So there's also another comment from Maria. She said her current collection plan was written primarily by the two curators at their university museum. The collections registrar and the exhibitions manager registrar had input, but with latter coordinating the process. The director was present in the meetings, and often provided direction. So that gives you a little bit more information about how Maria is handling that and what community, I guess, is involved was involved in writing that process. And Jen has the same question as Hope. She was wondering how collections committees are constituted, I guess.
Yeah, and I'd like if anyone has any examples of where they looked in the community to get this sort of input, yeah, please type that in, because that's a very good question. I mean, where do you look in the community? Do you look for specific groups? Do you randomize it? What part of the community? That would be very interesting for me to know, certainly.
It seems like they might be, I'm speaking from someone that used to work in an academic art museum, but it seems like plans are probably most fruitful when you involve more voices in the process, but then that also seems like it would be a challenge. So again, something to think about as we're navigating this as well. There's another comment. That she is a curator at a small academic art institution, and she is trying a faculty seminar as a way for a group of interdisciplinary faculty members to participate in collection envisioning in an advisory role, which is a 1-year term. And it meets once a month, and they have discussions, both practical and theoretical, about themes, curricular concerns, and so forth. Another comment from Julie. We are a small academic gallery run by one person, her, the director, and we don't actually have a collection, but the college in which we are a part of does. She is working with her art history colleagues to develop a collection stewardship plan, as we don't have one at all, and none of the work is actually cataloged. This would also help with future gifts of artwork to the college. We have fairly disparate collections of art, so fine art, decorative art, archaeological, and she is also wondering who to include in this process as well.
And we also didn't get to this question up here about from Suni, saying that she's a curator for a small museum, and they have multiple different sections in our collection plan, but when it came on the board, it was very disorganized. So she's actually asking for recommendations on where to start in terms of putting it together and how to keep it organized, which sounds like a big problem as well. Because what I'm hearing from a lot of folks is even if there's one person that's the leader, you have to get a lot of input from various other people. But it does sound like you really have to have a point person to keep everything together in a lot of these instances. Which is also generally, necessary for a lot of these tasks. But there certainly has to be input from a number of people, including folks from the community. But there has to be one person in charge. And it seems like in most of these instances, it ends up being a curator or perhaps a registrar. But I would like to do a poll of sorts to see exactly who is involved in this at different institutions based on, say, the size of the collection and what sorts of things were in it. Because it also sounds like if it's beyond just an art collection, things could get very, very hairy.
It seems like the most recent comment kind of bounces off your comment, Cali. It's saying that it would be useful to have language in the plan on the logic by which gifts will be accepted, which is also very helpful information by like request, donor, etc., acquisition, etc., etc. I saw a couple examples of that in some of the AAM sample documents that I thought was very helpful. And again, I think we will try and have some templates of that kind on the RAAMP site after this conversation, so you all can kind of compare and contrast what sections would really kind of fit well for your institutions.
Yeah, and I think having more of these sections that really provide that language is important because you do have to rewrite collection plans relatively often sometimes, in the face of financial problems, changes in the community, changes in administration. So I think it's really useful to have that language just so that the next person stepping in the future knows how the museum was operating and whether they want to continue that or not. But you should have all these things sort of fleshed out in black and white so that even if you do have to adapt at some point, there's somewhere to even begin in terms of your consideration. And even having that collection plan is going to give you things that you might not have realized you needed in there. So I think, yeah, getting more of these examples and having a sort of repository of these, as well as perhaps a survey, would actually be incredibly useful. So I'd actually like to know if anyone else has questions will be useful for something like a survey, things that we could sort of find out for you by getting more folks involved. And Ksenia has another statement. So related to that, she was tasked by the director to see if there are examples of language on museums only accepting gifts if they come with some kind of endowed funds, even if modest, that would allow for the care of the collection. And she asked if anyone's encountered such language. I've certainly heard about this, but I haven't actually seen language. And I would definitely like to, because I think it's important. First of all, well, I'd actually like to see a budget as well, to see what they would consider enough money for an endowment to take care of them. I mean, it's certainly going to depend on the object. It's going to depend on the choices you make for the object. But I feel like an example of that would be incredibly useful, for sure.
Hope also mentioned that it sounds like some people have questions about material for policy, the collection policy as well. Hope, do you mind just clarifying what you mean by material?
And the difference between what you mean by collection policy and collection planning.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was just struck by the last comments about acceptance of gifts and maybe funds, and was thinking that that would be something we would typically expect in our institution to have included in our collection policy, which we have. So some of like the nuts and bolts day to day, but I think for the collections plan, we're really kind of grappling with some of those bigger questions about future direction that aren't necessarily policy questions, like management of a collection, but more in some ways philosophical. And so I'm just wondering if how we're using those terms, and if some people are kind of lumping them together, if we're separating them. So that was just kind of where I was trying to go with that strange little comment.
No, yeah, I think Olivia and I were actually discussing this a little bit, that, I mean, collection plans can be so disparate that, I mean, a lot of times it really includes big picture stuff like the mission statement, stuff that you would expect really the director to be fashioning. But a lot of other times you end up getting a lot more policy and procedure that's kind of giving even more than guidelines on how to move into the future, but really very specific direction and ways of doing that. Oh, and Claire said that she had a bit of language around endowments, or the possibility in the language that we wrote for our collections management policy. And Claire, if you would be willing to share that, that would be absolutely wonderful. I understand if you can't, but we would love to have an example if you can provide it. And you can always send that to me after this chat. We'd just like to share a few more things so that people have a little bit more to work with. And someone has a recommendation for a survey. Oh, thank you, Claire. I will include that on our website once we post this recording. I really appreciate it. And Maria said for the survey, her question would be, how many museums are involved in rewriting their collections plans in response to changing priorities regarding underrepresentation or representation of previously underrepresented artists, including, for example, women, Native American, African American, etc.? I think that is a wonderful question, and it's certainly something, even in past coffee gatherings, that we had been discussing, especially when it came up to teaching diversity to docents and that sort of thing, because the curator had come in specifically for that and sort of had to change the collections plan. So that's a great question, and I'd like to know what the other reasons are as well.
I have seen in other examples as well that museums wrote their collection plan considering which academic courses were being given kind of in the long term. So in support of I guess, curricular development between the museum and art history classes, how the museum could continue to collect in order to support those classes. So I thought that was kind of somewhat related to Maria's comment, but another way of kind of bracketing the collections plan.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there could be a number of reasons. I think some could just be a change in administration, in, you know, the curators, the director, that sort of thing, or it could be financial, as I said. But we do have a lot of museums that are really trying different ways of coordinating with art history departments, as well as departments well beyond that. So that could be part of the bigger university planning. Yeah, seeing what causes this, as well as how it's done, I think could be really useful in sort of wrapping our head around the process. So what other questions do we have about going about this?
I guess I have a kind of a question for you all that you can respond to in the chat box on the left. Do you frequently share your collection plan with other institutions or publicly, maybe on your website?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of institutions are becoming much more transparent these days. So I think it's very interesting to see this. Elaine says that they have not. And I think I would expect that traditionally. Yeah, as an internal document.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and Denise says they plan to make it very public. But I do think we're at a very special time once we see anonymous spreadsheets about salaries in academic art museums going around, and I think that's one way of sort of combating the idea that the lack of transparency has created some issues. But it'll be good to at least have some examples, even if not everyone can share theirs.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and Julie says they're making theirs public as well. Oh, and Augustana's is on their website. Yeah, in a move toward transparency. Well, thank you, Claire. That's wonderful.
And Casey says they hope to include at least portions publicly, which would be fantastic for the Spencer Museum of Art, and to be transparent about their acquisition priorities and policies. And then Marianne just made the comment, sharing parts of the collection plan can help define the kinds of donations you might be looking for. And she intends to share it when the new version is ready. And that kind of picks up on a topic that Casey was curious about initially, in how to use the document when in conversation with donors, which I think is another really interesting topic. Another kind of discussion of use, and then maybe what sections you would share with a donor just to make sure that donors know the kind of the direction of where you want your museum to go, and if maybe their gifts would fit into that trajectory. And then there's another comment on the left, seeing it as internal, more of a guiding document, but one that they could use to engage faculty, collaborators, and students. So kind of internal, but internal as in university-wide use. And then the last comment, we plan to share an abbreviated version with plan giving officers in the foundation. That's fascinating. Again, kind of in the spirit of keeping everyone on the same page.
But it's interesting that we also see sort of shifting roles for this, from it being an internal document that's really for, guidance through the future, but also being used for outside communications with donors and collaborators and that sort of thing. So it seems like it could be a very basic internal document, or it could be a much more sprawling, public-facing document.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's actually another question I'd like to include in this survey is sort of how the document is used, and if it's had uses beyond what you expected, or if its role has changed. And if anyone else has their public-facing documents that you could share with us, we'd love to reshare them when we have this recording up, just to be able to have further discussions about what could be included. And yeah, I'd love to keep seeing survey questions come my way.
There's also another comment on the left. Elaine has shared their policy, or their plan with their acquisitions committee and board members as a way of making them feel more connected to the museum.
Yeah.
Great question from Denise on the left. For those who don't share the entire document, what sections are you excluding and why?
That's a great question. I mean, certainly the mission statement is something that, you know, is generally displayed on any museum's website. But, yeah, I'm wondering if a lot of it comes down to procedure, or what wouldn't you want to be available?
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear your answers.
Hi, this is Denise, who just wrote the question. Can you guys hear me?
Denise, yes.
Hi. Yeah, I'm genuinely curious because we are applying for accreditation this year, and we are in the tail end of putting our collecting plan together. And so far it's shaping out in a way that I feel like we could share the entire document. But I'm wondering if there are areas of the document for some institutions that might be more confidential, regarding, you know, finances or something that perhaps we're not including, you know. So I'm just genuinely interested. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we had someone say that they probably wouldn't share the deaccessioning plans because they might be sensitive, which I can completely understand. That's a very sensitive topic. So yeah, I can certainly understand why you wouldn't necessarily include a deaccession plan. Yeah, in terms of acquisitions, I think that tends to be useful to share, unless there's a halt on, you know, active acquiring, which I can also see, especially in the sort of financial straits that a lot of academics museums are in, especially this year. So does anyone else have parts that they haven't shared? We had Christina. You said that there was an abbreviated version. So I'd like to know if that was just a summary, because some of these can get relatively lengthy. Yeah, I think for donors, they probably don't want to read the entire thing.
So this is Christina.
Hi, Christina.
Yeah. Hey, how are you guys? Yeah, our plan would probably, as it's sort of being drafted, would probably be a little bit long. So we wanted to work with the gift officers who have asked us for some guidance.
Okay.
So it might be things specifically that we wouldn't collect, such as we don't collect bound books. That's just we don't library, so that they can have some general guidelines when they're out in the field meeting with donors and potential people who might be looking to leave things to the museum. This would give them a way, sort of a quick, hey, I know the museum is interested in collecting work by New Hampshire artists, so that could be an area that they'd be familiar with and could direct people to, but it could also give them some guidelines for things that we're not actively looking to collect in.
Right. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense.
But they don't need to have all like 12 pages of our collecting plan with our very specific gaps.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that absolutely does make sense. We have another question. Has anyone sought input from the general public rather than the campus community? And Denise said that yes, they've been in contact with collectors that they had previous relationships with, as well as other curators. But yeah, I'm wondering if it's just folks who sort of live in the general area. I mean, did you reach outside of both the campus and sort of the art museum field?
Looks like Elaine said she's not talking about necessarily the general public or visitors. So maybe not as far as a reach into the community,
Mm-hmm.
but staying somewhat kind of in the campus community, I'm assuming.
That would certainly be a good question for the survey, sort of, yeah, figuring out how far to reach for this sort of input.
I have another follow-up question for you all that have completed collections plans. Just generally, how long kind of from start to finish was the process? And should others kind of embarking on the process expect to dedicate to this process?
Oh, yeah. I feel like depending on the size of the sort of committee coming up with this, it could take quite a while. Oh, Maria said about 18 months. Yeah.
And I'm sure kind of including the more people in the process, the much longer time it takes, for sure, and different departments getting involved, like the plan giving team, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's helpful to know, just to kind of, for those considering, or those many one woman academic museums that are taking it on as director, collections manager, to kind of see what the scope of the creation process would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can anyone else provide an estimate of how long it took them? I think depending on, the number of sections, it could be a relatively short amount of time, but I can see a lot of these taking very long. If you have to talk to a number of people, at least half a dozen.
Mm-hmm.
About 3 months to write, but much longer with input from others. I can definitely see that.
That's definitely another good question for the survey that we can share after this as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would like, if anyone thinks of survey questions after this, they can also send that to me. But I would like to create a survey to sort of get a little bit more participation so that we can discuss these things. And we have another question. Suni asks if there's a specific database system or process that you use when creating your collections plan, since she's revising and revisiting and revising the current one.
It looks like the last time it was revisited was over 10 years ago, so quite the process.
And Christina also said she would add that people who have expertise in a content area that we lack, and we are using they use the database to filter their collection. So yeah, that absolutely makes sense. To see sort of exactly how strong and weak you are in certain areas, to recognize gaps, that sort of thing. And Christina, what kind of database do you have, if you wouldn't mind?
Sure. So we have a off-the-shelf system, collector system. It's very basic. Previously, I've used Embark at 2 other institutions, which is very robust, and I really like the folks that run TMS and Embark, but we needed something down and dirty because we didn't have one.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have a system at all. Everything was still in paper files, and I think it was in, I don't know, it might have been Excel. So when we were thinking about a collections database, I really wanted something that I could implement very quickly, and so collector systems, we were able to do that. It may not it may not be right for everybody, but so far it's worked for us, and we're able to sort of filter and link images and notes and all of what we need. And then in terms of thinking about a collections plan, who I would add to it, I think everyone's kind of covered different people that they would add, but I'd like to have outside voices, so other arts professionals, people at other museums who might have had experience, and that's what I meant by people who have expertise in other content areas. So maybe a curator at another institution nearby. There are some people on this call who might be, I could reach out to.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd always, in my past life, I had always used FileMaker, which is essentially, it's very easy to sort of build what you need, but it's getting a little old, and I think there are a lot of better databases for that now.
Yeah, we were originally, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So originally we were, again, thinking about Embark, and I've implemented that twice at other institutions, and it has the capability, I think, of over 800 different distinct fields. And when I got to, it has 800 fields. So it's very, again, like I said, it's very robust, and there's a lot of information that you can dump into it. And when I came here and I looked at what the collection manager was actually using to catalog the objects, and I looked at the catalog data worksheet, there were only 23 fields. They're only, we're only collecting information on 23 aspects of the object. So I was like, I don't really need 800. I need something very simple. Location, what is it, when was it made? They weren't even assigning historical periods. So it's not as though I could type in Baroque and find anything. Everything would have to be recatalogued. So kind of knowing where you're starting from and then transitioning to a collections database, really, like, if you need 800 fields and you've got that information and you're going to input it, that's wonderful and amazing. And if you have like really basic information and you just need to have something that's mobile, that's portable, that's web accessible, there are other systems out there that you can work with. So again, are there some things that I dislike about collector systems? Yes, there's something kind of funky about the way that you would log in loans. Loans in and out of your own collection and things that you're maybe borrowing for a temporary exhibition. But we're pretty small, so I can work around that. My collection manager works around that. But otherwise, it's been fine. Eric, the owner, has been terrific. He's easy to work with, and he's been able to modify some things just for us. So that's in response to Denise's question. So she's thinking of moving to collector systems from TMS. And again, that's where you'd have to talk with Eric, because TMS is such a huge system. I don't know how they would, again, I just don't know if all of the information that you're using would be collected, but their support team would be able to tell you.
Yeah, and what fields do you think were really useful when you were sort of looking at the overall scope of the collection and trying to maybe recognize gaps or strengths?
So again, we were looking at sort of like by object type and support. What first we kind of did a slice through like how many paintings do we have, how many prints do we have, and then within those we could look at like where were they made, who made them, and again, because the cataloging information that they were taking in, we couldn't really sort by subject or content area. So it's not as though I could look for, I don't know, religious scenes. They're just it didn't have that depth to it. So we had to go with really sort of basic information. Was it figural? Was it landscape? It was very, like I said, very, very basic. But then within that, again, I have a very small collection. It's only 2,200 objects, not 22,000 or 200,000. So it made it a lot easier. But I think there are a lot of academic institutions that have received benevolent gifts over the years. And if they were founded and stewarded, if the collections were stewarded by faculty, then you have a reflection of what the faculty were interested in, or maybe what they were using to teach with. And there isn't a real coherence to the collection because of that. You have pockets, you'll have pockets of strength based on when that faculty was managing the collection, or maybe they had the greatest influence, or maybe there was a particular donor at a time that, we had a donor who collected Japanese prints. So we have, I think, 250 Japanese prints in the collection, but nobody here teaches Asian art.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so when I was saying, like, well, you know, what's an area that you wouldn't collect in? I probably wouldn't intentionally collect Japanese prints anymore. I would consider it a closed collection because nobody's currently using it to teach with. But I wouldn't necessarily then put that out publicly because somebody could come forward and say, I have an incredible collection of Japanese works on paper that were produced during the early 20th century that would complement the historic Japanese prints that you have.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to say, I wouldn't be too quickly to say no to things. I wouldn't put out too many no's publicly, but I think that I would consider the Japanese prints closed.
Oh, interesting. Because we had certain parts of the collection that were really useful for the art school. Like we had, actually this came from Japanese prints, prints that showed each step of the woodblock process. So that was really useful for all the print students. But then we had, completely different things for, say, the art history students that were doing research on specific things. But there were also a few things for, you know, the history of science and that sort of thing. So it was very interesting to see what folks were teaching outside of art history as well.
Right,
So,
right.
So yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Sure. And just in response, somebody was saying, how are you defining strengths and weaknesses? Is it numbers of objects or specific quality? And in my mind, because we all have teaching collections, I would also add utility.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the interpretations that you really need to figure out for a collections plan. I mean, I think you have to come up with your own definition of what's really necessary.
Exactly.
So not just the fact that the collection has a strength, but is it useful? Is there something that's really necessary in the community that's not being touched on? It'll be really interesting to kind of tease out the different reasonings for creating different sorts of collection plans.
Ellie, I think you mentioned FileMaker Pro as your kind of wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Claire had a question. She said her ears perked up when you mentioned that. That's where she is at the moment, and she's currently deep in thought about it and other options. Does anyone advise keeping FileMaker Pro or any other collections management systems?
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert, but I feel like FileMaker Pro is very customizable, but you need to be ready to do the work to customize it, and you need to figure out how you want it before you move forward. It's harder to go back and make those changes. I get the feeling that CMS might be a little bit more catered toward what you already need, but I'd like to hear what others have to say.
There's also another question from Julie, and also Laura. I'll start with Julie's. Hers is very specific, but as she mentioned, she has disparate collections that they take into account when they created the collection plan. There are some oddballs such as oral histories. Does it make sense to fold something in to a plan like that, or place them in college archives, which is kind of a separate entity on its own? But first, another question. Does your college or university have archives? And if so, are they kept separate from the museum or gallery? It's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, for me at Penn State, there were archives that were sort of related to the special collections in the library, and that was completely separate from the Palmer. But we would talk back and forth if we wanted to have specific shows about that sort of thing. But the library also had their own photograph collections, so we kind of had to deal with the ownership of different things over time. And Denise said they transfer ownership of those oddballs to the university history collection, right, and our library special collections. And Christina asked, if you're collecting media, do you have a preservation plan and funds to transfer and maintain the equipment, hardware, software in perpetuity? That's an interesting question. And I'm wondering, this kind of, in a small way, goes back to the idea of when you acquire something, does it come with an endowment? I feel like that's a huge question for things like any kind of new media issues, because you have to consider at the very beginning what its capabilities are going to be in the future. So that's a very good question. Oh, and Julie asked, or Hope asked Julie, or said she likes the question, and if anyone's thinking about overlap with other campus collections when drafting the collections plans. And I think I'm absolutely sure that's the case for some folks, because as I said, at Penn State we really had to deal with what the library had. There was also an archaeological museum, and then the art museum itself. So this is going to be good for a survey question, because I'd really be interested in what all needs to be considered when you're creating a new collection plan, in addition to why you're creating a new collection plan.
There was also a question that I think I mentioned that I was going to ask on behalf of Julie. She was asking how specific your acquisition priorities are within a plan. If they're more kind of broad or very, very kind of grounded in specific research. So another great question for a follow-up survey as well.
And Ksenia said that her museum has transferred holdings to the University Anthropology Museum in the past, which I can also definitely see. And Denise said that we work closely with the History Museum and Special Collections on campus. We meet frequently, draft similar policies. So yeah, that's really interesting. And I know, especially with bigger universities, there can be any number of museums. I think at Penn State there are probably about a dozen that are in various states of organization, display, maintenance. So I think it would be very useful to at least keep track of the other sort of collections in the area, and, you know, possibly collaborate at some point, but also just to see where your role is and what kind of role you're fulfilling for that community in addition to these other collections. Wonderful. I think we have a pretty good slate of questions to move forward with, and I'd love to get in touch with everyone in the future and see if they'd be willing to answer this survey, as well as come up with other questions. So feel free to email myself or Olivia. I'm at cbuckley@collegeart.org. She is Knauss@collegeart.org. So just feel free to write that down and send more questions to us later if you think of them. And Claire said, we did a lot of that too in Augustana. We shifted collections between special collections and a Swedish immigration archive. Interesting. So all of us working together to be the best stewards of objects. So yeah, that sounds like a fantastic collaboration. And for Julie, the person who runs the archives and the person who runs the library's special collections work very closely. It's wonderful. Oh, thank you all. I appreciate your thanks back. It's been lovely having this conversation, and I'd like to have some more. So, like I said, please feel free to get in touch with us. If you have some examples, we'd love to share those too. And hopefully we will be sending out a survey and having more to add to this conversation. So thank you, everyone.